So we'll set a positive motivation, generating as we do the minds of confidence in the wisdom of the Buddha, the reliability of his teachings, their power to bring the intended result of one's own enlightenment. Combined with a sense of refuge, turning toward the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners who deeply understand his teachings as the way in which we find safe harbor, safe direction. The mind of bodhicitta, desiring to accomplish the Buddha's path, principally to be of benefit to others, to unlock the mind's potential, and to be of ultimate limitless benefit to countless sentient beings. So we take these as our motivation. All right, as promised, we begin with day 209, which is the first contemplation on the middle scope of the Lamrim. And so, of course, we are here when we were on the small scope, we were engaging in the practices held in common with practitioners of the small scope. And here we engage in practices held in common with practitioners of the middle scope, or middling scope, sometimes translated middling. And actually, here, Lama Zopa in the commentary on day 209, and in one place they call it the second level, which is kind of a bit more neutral, but then of course, it says medium capable being, so lesser. That's kind of the way that Lama Zopa often has translated it: lesser capable being, medium, and medium capable being. So the practitioners who are small scope practitioners, their goal is to engage with the Buddha's wisdom for the for the purpose of accomplishing a good future rebirth. And only for if a person is a practitioner of the small scope, then that is the entirety of their motivation. When a Mahayana practitioner is engaging with the practices held in common with practitioners of the small scope, then it serves a slightly different purpose overall. It is the wisdom or the inner technology that permits a person to accomplish good future rebirth and to avoid bad, quote unquote, bad or relatively or comparatively disadvantageous rebirths. But it isn't a good in and of itself. It serves that purpose, but it serves that purpose in a larger, situated in a larger context of being able then to have a succession of good human, or you could say perfect human rebirths that allow for the causes and the conditions to come together to complete one's training and to achieve enlightenment. And the same is true in a way for the way that a Mahayana practitioner relates to the practices held in common with practitioners of the small scope. Of the middle scope, which is what we're discussing over the next few weeks. These practitioners, if they were Theravada practitioners, then they would have practiced the practices held in common with practitioners of the small scope, and then they would also practice the practices held in common with practitioners of the middle scope. And for them, for Theravadan practitioners, the middle scope, which is just how we would refer to it, but that collection of teachings would serve as the vehicle that they would use to achieve arhatship, or nirvana, or lesser nirvana, lower nirvana, individual liberation, however you want to phrase it. And so the reason why that's a bit different from a Mahayana context is because in the Mahayana context, it actually can't serve that purpose, because a Mahayana practitioner actually doesn't meditate on emptiness in the middle scope. That is a great scope practice that is presented in the great scope. And so, whereas the great scope as a whole, as a sort of combined unit of wisdom or method and wisdom, is unique to the Mahayana tradition. However, directly perceiving the nature of reality is common to all Buddhist traditions. So the fact that for a Theravadan practitioner, they don't have obviously a great scope, and therefore the teachings and the meditation on seeing emptiness directly would have to be part of what we would consider this section of material. They would have to include that, and then it would really just be bodhicitta that they're not practicing. That would be part of the great scope. But for a Mahayana practitioner, that is delayed. That is you could, of course, meditate on emptiness, throughout, but it's presented in the great scope, because for a Mahayana practitioner, the purpose of the practices held in common with the practitioner of the middle scope is just renunciation from cyclic existence. But just renunciation of cyclic existence isn't sufficient to achieve arhatship. It has to be combined with wisdom realizing emptiness. So just to say that, there is a difference in terms of where that particular meditation would be situated. So it's not, we can't, in a way, we sort of can't say that it is that it is all of the practices held in common with practitioners of the middle scope, because the small and the middle scope are, as a full practice, is what a Theravada practitioner does, but they also meditate on the nature of reality. However, for a Mahayana practitioner, that gets pushed into the great scope. So of course he says, what we will now be looking at are the teachings on the second level, the graduated path of the medium capable being, which is for those not seeking just a better future rebirth, but also individual liberation from all suffering. And of course, they can't do that. They can't actually seek liberation from all suffering without meditating on the nature of reality, meditating on emptiness, getting a direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness. But from the Mahayana presentation of the Lamrim, you don't actually include the meditation on seeing emptiness directly in the middle scope. Okay. So the quotation for day 209 is, we need to see the whole of samsara as a raging fire. So, of course, here, as I said last week, this section is serving a similar function to, in the small scope, the meditations on the suffering of the lower realms. It's simply expanding on that general premise. And it is expanding it not only to encourage the practitioner to think about just the sufferings of the worst kinds of rebirth, but to think of the sufferings of any kind of rebirth that happens under the influence of past karma and illusions. Okay. So then Lama Zopa, talks about how he talks about sort of the third type of suffering within the first noble truth. The true suffering, could say the truth of suffering or true suffering. I usually would say true suffering because the Four Noble Truths are the four ways in which an Arya being understands the world. And ordinary beings, non-Arya beings, also look at the world and also have an understanding of the world, but it's different. It's not the same as an Arya being's understanding of the world. So how an ordinary being defines suffering is different than how an Arya being defines suffering. So we think, as ordinary beings, we think that we do understand, what suffering is. But to refer to the first noble truth and all of the truths, the Four Noble Truths, as true, true suffering, true origin, true cessation, true path, I think that helps to get at this distinction between the way in which an Arya being has an understanding of the world and the way in which an ordinary being has an understanding of the world, because they both look at the world and they both see suffering, and they're both motivated to overcome suffering. But the way that an ordinary person is doing that is quite different than the way that an Arya being would do that. So as Lama Zopa says, as I mentioned, he's going to talk about the third category of suffering, which is the suffering, which is all-pervasive suffering. he says dukkha, which, so the word in the first noble truth that's translated as suffering is the word dukkha, the Pali word dukkha. He says dukkha means suffering, but suffering at all levels. He says, perhaps we can use the word, quote, dissatisfaction. What it really means is having an uncontrolled mind. So samsara is really appropriating ordinary aggregates, a body and mind that is ordinary, that is under the control of karma and delusion. And so as long as our mind remains uncontrolled, remains ordinary, then we will continue lifetime after lifetime to appropriate more physical forms and a continuity of mind that both continuities of form and mind are going to be the karmic result of past karma and delusion. So, of course, then he says, until we break the chain of cause and effect that traps us in samsara, we will continue to suffer for lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. So this continuity of ordinary aggregates of body and mind that are conditioned by past karma and delusion do have their own sort of inertia, their own momentum, and they have to be intentionally overcome. They have to be intentionally subverted in a way that those causes, those conditions. He says there is no end to samsara without purifying even the most subtle delusions that sit on our mind stream. Sit is an interesting way of phrasing it, but the subtlest stains or the subtlest karmic imprints that are present in the mind. He says this requires understanding that samsaric pleasures are nothing other than suffering and have the strength to turn our back on them. So here he's kind of going to changeable suffering. He started out by talking about the all-pervasive suffering, the idea that no sentient being no ordinary sentient being in Buddhism implies, or you could say is the definition of an ordinary being. The definition of a sentient being is an ordinary being. Buddhas are not referred to as sentient beings. They have mind, but the phrase sentient being is reserved for ordinary beings. So we usually say ordinary sentient being, but it actually means you're kind of just saying the same thing twice. Ordinary being and sentient being is exactly the same thing. So he first said that any sentient being is necessarily experiencing an existence conditioned by suffering, that there is no place within cyclic existence that an ordinary sentient being can take rebirth and just spontaneously be free of suffering. But then he goes and kind of addresses the second category of suffering, the suffering of change, which is where he says, this requires understanding that samsaric pleasures are nothing more than suffering and have the strength and having the strength to turn our back on them. So turning our back on what we think of as pleasurable, recognizing that there is no pleasure in that object, that momentarily, so of course this sort of psychological model is something that we've probably defined or explained before, but essentially a person is when a person engages in pleasure-seeking behavior of any kind, eating something, drinking something, watching something, speaking to someone, etc., they are motivated to do so based on some perceived defect in the present moment. If the present moment were thoroughly satisfying, then it wouldn't occur to a person. Apart from, it wouldn't occur to the person to engage in a pleasure-seeking behavior. It would still occur to the person to eat food and to drink water and so on in order to continue to survive. But it wouldn't occur to that person to eat ice cream or unless they were offered and they wanted to help the person who made the offering to accumulate the karma, the merit of having made the offering. But they wouldn't go to the store and buy unhealthy food, or they wouldn't be motivated to drink alcohol or probably even soda or something. But so when we engage in a pleasure-seeking behavior, it is because we believe that there is some defect in the present moment. The present moment isn't thoroughly satisfying. It needs to be improved upon. So there's an agitation that arises in the mind that motivates pleasure-seeking behavior. So then we engage in some sort of pleasure-seeking behavior, watching eating something, listening to something, etc. And that, assuming that we are successful in going to that movie or eating that food or talking to that person on the phone, etc., eventually, simply by continuing to engage in that action that we ourselves were motivated to engage in, we will begin to find that to be a source of dissatisfaction. The person that we most enjoy speaking to, the food that we most enjoy eating, if it doesn't stop, it itself will become painful. It itself, without anyone taking it away or changing it outwardly, simply the continued contact with that object will itself be experienced as pain at some point. And so, if that's true, then what is happening is that any object that we put into the category of pleasurable and therefore have some motivation to sometimes seek is coming along with its own attendant suffering experience. And that simply becomes stronger, more manifest over time, because initially there was a sense of relief when the agitation that we were experiencing that motivated the pleasure-seeking behavior was reduced temporarily by the introduction of a new novel stimulus. We were kind of bored or bored or something that was agitating the mind, and it was momentarily soothed with the introduction of this novel stimulus. But regardless of what that novel stimulus is, over time, that novel stimulus that we ourselves, no one told us, oh, hey, this is what you should regard as pleasurable. We decided that we like this kind of food or this kind of music. But because the object itself is not inherently pleasurable, then the attendant suffering that is mixed or tied with the object will become more and more manifest the more that the kind of momentary sense of relief from that previous agitation is, the more time has passed from that sort of initial momentary sense of relief, that the agitation kind of started up here. We introduced a new novel stimulus, and then there was this sense of relief, and that feels like pleasure. That sense of the reduction in that agitation feels and is labeled by the mind as pleasure, as happiness. And so we enjoy that initial period of time. But because no matter what stimulus we might choose is mixed with its own suffering, then the more that we interact with it, the more that attendant suffering will appear to the mind, and then that serves as the agitation that's going to motivate another pleasure-seeking behavior. And if we can successfully engage in that second pleasure-seeking behavior, then we will again experience that momentary sense of relief, and then the process will begin again, and then it will begin again, and then it will begin again. And we spend our whole lives going through that cycle, kind of chasing those brief periods of relief. So Lama Zopa is saying that we need to really think about that process and reduce our pleasure-seeking behavior in a way to train the mind over time, that there is no happiness there. There is no pleasure in the object. Any thoughts or questions? So then he says, until we have the feeling that whatever is in samsara, whether it is the most terrible suffering of the hells or the divine pleasure of the gods, is a blazing fire that will consume us, there is no way to attain liberation. Then there is no way to attain liberation and enlightenment. This is why we must understand suffering in all its manifestations. So all we're doing here in the middle scope is elaborating on our understanding of suffering. We limited it to the lower realms in the small scope in order to be able to focus on doing what's necessary to set ourselves up for a succession of perfect human rebirths, which is important and critical, and that's why the small scope exists. That's why it's critically important, and that's why mastering the small scope is an extraordinary accomplishment. It is compared to an ordinary sentient being. I mean, of course, a person who has mastered the small scope is still an ordinary sentient being, but compared to someone who isn't trying to accomplish any of this, or someone who is trying but just hasn't done it yet, actually mastering the small scope and actually genuinely becoming someone who is oriented to future lives, more so, vastly more so than they are oriented to the content of just this one life, is a truly remarkable, change in that person. And here, so as I say, we're just adding to our understanding by including and thinking about now not only the disadvantages of those lower realm rebirths, but the disadvantages of any kind of ordinary rebirth. Which, if we were a Theravadan practitioner, and we were also going to meditate on the nature of reality, would lead us then to individual liberation. But as I say, because we're practicing in the Mahayana tradition, the role of the middle scope is really just focused on renunciation, on this weariness with cyclic existence as a whole. And then once we've gotten that weariness, that sense of, even Lama Zopa, has in various places even gone so far as to use the word revulsion with, remaining in, not participating in cyclic existence in terms of, like, from a compassionate bodhisattva standpoint, but doing so as an ordinary sentient being, experiencing samsara, and not merely experiencing it, but experiencing it with all of the limitations that we currently have. Certainly the bodhisattvas are more than willing, more than happy to take rebirth again and again, and the Buddhas too are constantly taking, emanating for an enlightened being. You wouldn't say reincarnating, you would say emanating, but emanating back into cyclic existence for the benefit of sentient beings. So the revulsion isn't with cyclic existence itself, it is with actually just being an ordinary person uncontrollably participating in cyclic existence, kind of being fed up or disgusted or sick and tired of that kind of experience. That is the purpose for us of the middle scope. And then we join that with bodhicitta and emptiness and calm abiding on the great scope. So then in day 210, Lama Yeshe is now saying, suffering is not found in external objects. It is our ignorant mind that is miserable. So again, this is kind of reinforcing that idea that the bodhisattvas are not concerned about, the content of cyclic existence, because their own mind is not experiencing it as suffering. It's perfectly for them, they continue to abide in perfect bliss and so on, even though they are in a samsaric, you could say a samsaric environment, but samsara really is not the place. Samsara is the way in which that place is experienced by the kind of mind doing the experiencing. So then he says, he brings up Lama Yeshe, this sort of common view that Buddhism is a bit sort of morbid in focusing so much on suffering. But as I've mentioned before, really Buddhists focus on suffering in the same way that doctors focus on disease. We wouldn't say that it's morbid for a heart surgeon to deeply, exquisitely, intimately understand all of the things that can go wrong with the heart. They're not bummed out. I mean, I'm sure, of course, they're to some degree sad, maybe, about the fact that that's happening to people, just like bodhisattvas, are compassionate toward and kind of have an open-hearted sense toward the fact that ordinary beings are also experiencing it. But for a doctor, their interest is, well, this isn't hopeless. This isn't something outside of my control. I can help people, but only if when they come to me, I can accurately diagnose what's happening. I need to be able to distinguish a stroke from a heart attack. I need to be able to distinguish angina from, whatever, from some sort of other irregular heartbeat or something, all of these different things. If I can't distinguish one from the other, then I am of no benefit to sentient beings. And so we are of no benefit to sentient beings unless we understand suffering to an incredibly deep, incredibly subtle level, and therefore apply the antidotes that deal with suffering on those incredibly deep, incredibly subtle levels. Because if a heart surgeon only understood one kind of thing that could go wrong with the heart, then they might know how to deal with that one thing, but their effectiveness would be severely limited. So of course, there are people who understand certain kinds of suffering of poverty, the suffering of, different things, and they are applying antidotes to those, and that's helpful, but it's limited compared to understanding suffering down to its incredibly most subtle levels, and then knowing what the effective antidotes are for even those extraordinary subtle levels of suffering. He says, if we examine our own minds just on a day-to-day basis, we will see how up and down the mind is. One moment, someone says something nice, or the weather is nice, or we have, we're eating something that we enjoy, and the mind is quite content. And then the next moment, someone, cuts us off in traffic, or we get some bad news, or we hear something, that depresses us, and then, all of that elation is completely gone from the mind, and the mind is now, and then half an hour later, 2 hours later, something else. So there's this sort of ping-ponging that happens day to day, where we're up and we're down, and we're up and we're down. And so Lama Yeshe is saying that's the uncontrolled nature of the mind, and that is suffering. That is the source of suffering, is that we have no control over, there's no space in the mind between these objects that appear and the way that they influence us. Again, I mean, he's not directly here talking about seeing things as inherently or intrinsically existent, but really that's at the heart of it. If we didn't see these things, these objects, as inherently existent, and we didn't see ourselves that way, then there wouldn't be that up and down nature of the mind. It requires that we misunderstand the nature of the self and the nature of other objects in order to give rise to that kind of experience. So then he says, that, kind of going back to what has been said before about the difference between the way that Arya beings and ordinary beings define suffering, its origin, the way in which it ceases, the paths that a person would use. An ordinary being is going to say, well, suffering is poverty and disease and not having the kinds of foods that I like and the kinds of comforts that I enjoy, not being regarded by others in the way that I would prefer. And so the path, to the cessation of that would be to accumulate wealth and status and power, resources, and it's true for brief periods of time. If you can accumulate wealth, then insofar as you could do that, you're able to access more comfort, better food, etc. But as Lama Yeshe says, the manifest world demonstrates the up and down nature of mundane reality. So even people who are wealthy, even people who have everything, they still suffer mentally in many ways. And in some ways, they under some circumstances, for some, they may even be suffering a bit more, because they no longer have any hope that there's, they've seen it. They have all of the money, they have all of the possessions, and they've demonstrated to themselves that it doesn't work. Whereas we haven't really done that. We're kind of still on that hamster wheel. And so we hold out hope. And for most of us, we'll die never actually having proven to ourselves directly that it doesn't work. And that's, in a way, actually, you could say worse, because we think, well, maybe if I did get this, if I have, I have $50,000, but if I had $10 million, then we get $10 million. I think, well, yeah, but so many people have $100 million and they seem like they're really happy. And then we get the 100 million. But then at a certain point, you seem to see additional, high rates of drug addiction and, depression and suicide. And, oh yeah, I'm seeing an unstable, sorry about that, the internet. Weather seems fine. Don't know. So, yeah, really what Lama Yeshe is saying is that all we have to do is look at, analyze the world, and we can see that chasing externalities is not effective, is not the cause of happiness. And the billionaires of the world are demonstrating that to us because they're getting divorced, they are having scandals, and they're sometimes killing themselves and going into rehab and so on. And Buddhism would say, even if someone seemed, even if, because certainly that's not universally true. I'm sure that there are people who are content, who are able to put together 40 or 50 years, of that kind of access to resources, and that they're generally, on average, as content or more content than the ordinary, the lesser. I'm certain that's also true. But then they die, and Buddhism would say, well, all that they did was spend their time and their energy and their effort pursuing things that had no lasting impact, that didn't translate into any kind of benefit that persisted beyond their death. So that's the best case scenario, is that you are objectively, relatively, pretty happy, pretty content. And those sorts of disadvantages don't happen to you, but Buddhism would say, well, you still wasted all of that time that could have been better spent actually, instead of chasing more wealth, more status, etc., cultivating states of mind that actually bring happiness. Any thoughts or questions? Oh. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today with those two contemplations. Any thoughts or questions? All right. So we'll end with dedication. So we recollect our altruistic motivation. And we think that by having listened and participated, we've actualized that motivation and created positive energy in the mind. And that positive energy will ripen in beneficial and supportive ways. We particularly want to dedicate it to ripen in the ways that specifically support our spiritual growth and development. So think about what that means in your own life. And just strongly visualize and dedicate and seal that positive energy and in ripening in those particularly spiritually beneficial ways. All right. Well, good to see you.